the chairman of the USCCB's Committee on Doctrine. Bishop Flores has led the Synod process in the United States for the USCCB since Pope Francis began the Synod on Synodality in 2021. Welcome, Bishop Flores.
Gloria, it's great to be with you. Thank you.
And I introduce our final panelist, Bishop Robert Barron, Bishop of Winona, Rochester, Minnesota. Bishop Barron has served as the 9th Bishop of Winona, Rochester since 2022, and he is currently the chairman of the USCCB's Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life, and Youth. Bishop Barron is also the founder of the global media ministry Word on Fire, which reaches millions of people a year. Welcome, Bishop Barron.
Gloria, thank you. Great being with all of you.
So good to see you, all of
Thanks.
you. So His Eminence, Your Eminence, Cardinal McElroy, would you please open this gathering with a prayer?
Lord our God, you came into the world to call us to unity and to call us also to take from the gospel our mission to transform the world in which we live, to bring the values of your own heart and soul, the virtues of mercy and compassion, of understanding, of sacrifice and integrity, and courage and fortitude, of hope and joy. And through our lives and through our organizing together and speaking truth to the world, to bring those virtues more into the hearts of our culture, into our church, into our politics, and into our world. Bless us, Lord, in this conversation, where we are at a pivotal moment in which all of these values are called into question. And we are called in this dialogue to try to discern a pathway forward. Guide us in this pathway to truth, to peace, and to solidarity with one another. We ask this through you who live and reign forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that's watching that at the 1/2 mark, we will open for questions. Feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature on the Zoom, and we'll try to get to them at 1/2. Well, let's start first by talking about polarization. Why do we care? What it is? What is it? I see some people call it toxic polarization to make it clear as to why it's a problem. But I would like to ask each of you what you think polarization is and why we should care about it as believing Catholics. Can we start with His Eminence, Cardinal McElroy?
Sure. I think one of the issues that has exacerbated polarization in the life of the church is the degree to which politics has entered into the life of the church. And by that, I mean partisan politics. The church is called to be transforming the culture of our politics, but so often now it's going in the reverse direction with toxic consequences, I think. In around 1960, there was a poll that asked people, if your son or daughter married someone of the opposite political party, would you be very upset? And the number that said yes in 1960 was only 5%. Now it's 40%. And I think part of that is that partisan label has now taken on the role of being a shorthand for worldview. That it encapsulates in many people's minds the whole series, constellation of outlooks that people have in a way that is oppositional. And so because of that, that has come into the life of the church and exacerbated the stresses that are already there. Catholics have always disagreed on the substance of issues, but it's not an entirely new phenomenon, but the depth of it is very alarming because people are coming toward each other in the life of the church, looking first at that label, what are you? Where do you stand in the warlike culture politics of our country, rather than what unites us and where do we stand in terms of our identity as Catholics and with a Christological outlook. So I think that's a very severe change in not only the politics of society as a whole, but how it's come into the life of the church.
As I listen to you, it sounds like politics and political affiliation is taking the place of God. And hopefully that would not, we need to try to do something to bring that back, remove that, especially among believers, especially among Catholics. Your Excellency, Bishop Flores, I'm curious also to understand your take as well on polarization, if there's something else you would add or emphasize.
Yes, thanks. I mean, kind of following upon what Cardinal just said, there is something different about the way we are talking about political matters right now. And in some ways, polarization involves talking past each other. We're not really, we're talking about things, and it has a certain sort of a twin that goes with polarization. I think it's a tendency to make caricatures of those whom we disagree with. A caricature is like a cartoon figure with exaggerated features to make it more easily identified as something that's very bad. And so it hinders in some ways what the principal aim of politics, at least is the way the church's traditions understood it, which is a communal work of reason to achieve the good. If we're talking past each other, then we're not really reasoning together, and that it is a work of reason, and it's hard to do that because there's a lot of passion involved. But I think the aim of the good that we seek is very important to keep in mind, and it's hard to do that if you're not really listening to kind of what the communal conversation is about. In some ways, I think our current situation, politics participates in sort of, it's almost a religion, and sometimes it's a sport. And actually, it's not supposed to be either. It's supposed to be a civil conversation on the different levels, local or national or statewide, to seek what is good and to make the priority how to achieve it and how to avoid what is evil. And I think if we can stay focused on that, we can kind of tone down the caricature and the sort of the rhetoric that seeks to dehumanize people, really.
Thank you. Bishop Barron, what would you add about polarization and maybe what should be concerning about it?
Well, I agree with my brothers, what they were saying. There's, as the Cardinal mentioned, there's always been disagreement in the church. I mean, from day one, you find it in the pages of the Acts of the Apostles and the letters of Paul. There have been disagreements. That isn't something new or necessarily something bad. I mean, we have a spirited, intelligent dialogue with each other about where we disagree. What's happened now is a kind of tribalism, I would say, is a falling into opposing camps. And what's broken down is the love that makes real dialogue possible. So if to love means to will the good of the other, that in the measure we become tribalistic, we forget that. And now it becomes simply a matter of winning an argument or, waving the flag of my tribe, as opposed to all of us together endeavoring to learn the truth. And see, that's born of love, that I really want what's good for the other. That's what concerns me. And where I see it in my work in the internet space, one of the most, I mean, to be blunt about it, fetid, toxic places to go is the internet world. And you look at the comm boxes and you look at, they're not conversations. I won't dignify them with that word. It's just the throwing back and forth of invective and smear tactics and so on. That's where it's really broken down. And you see this tribalistic, and sadly, not just in the political culture, in the culture of the church, you see it. So that's how I'd characterize polarization. It's a tribalism that's lost the sense of love in dialogue.
One of the things the Holy Father has said in Fratelli Tutti is that we need kindness. And he gives some examples of, just being kind throughout the day. And so much of that, to me at least, seems to be missing in the space of social media, like you just spoke about, Bishop Barron. And yet we know St. John Paul II in the New Evangelization said, we must go where the people are.
Yeah.
And so the people are also on social media. How can we engage in dialogue and encourage love in a place that's so toxic? I'll leave this open to whoever feels moved to speak about it first. How do we encourage love in places that are so toxic?
I'll just say something real quick based on my experience of the internet is to stress truth and beauty. So I've tried always to avoid polemics in my work. I've been doing this for about 20 some years, is not to get involved in tribalistic argumentation, but to emphasize the truth and beauty of the tradition. Something I've said to people when they've asked my advice is before you hit that little button saying send on a comment, ask yourself the simple question: is this comment an act of love? Now, it doesn't mean it has to be just namby-pamby, nicey-nicey. You can be sharp and clear in what you're saying, but is it born of love? Is it born of a desire to will the good of the other? If it's not, there's like 1,000 better things for you to be doing than sending that statement.
Yeah.
I would say, go ahead, please.
No, just quickly to kind of follow up on that. One of the things that I say to confirmation kids when I go around the diocese is it's always good to remember what Jesus would not do when he was out amongst the people. It was not without its polemic in his time. That is one of the things to remember, that he would not be unkind, especially to the poor and to those who had no standing in the world. And also, he would never commit an injustice in order to kind of promote justice. These are the things that Jesus would not do. And he was in the world, the same world we're in, and I think those sorts of sort of manner of being in the world already sort of helps to give a space where we know when to refrain, because sometimes we can be very unjust when, like Bishop Barron said, we push that send button because we're reacting out of a passion that has very little to do with the pursuit of the truth, which, as everybody from Plato to St. Thomas and after would say, is largely dialogical in its pursuit.
I would say that our call in life, the moral call, is to do good and avoid evil. And Bishop Flores and Bishop Barron have talked about some of the things people should not be doing. That quite obviously, people of faith should not be doing these things. But there's also the do good, and that is, what is it? How can we move to a deeper level where we build solidarity among people? So we try to break down this tribalism. About 12 years ago, the Bishops' Conference did a study on how could we unite Catholics? What will bring Catholics together, specifically across the pattern? And they were talking about mainly societal, political issues that divide us. And they interviewed people in the pews, leaders in the church, all different kinds of people, and came to the conclusion that the one way that brought people together across the borders, those who are pro-life and stressing euthanasia, those who are stressing the poor and peace, all these, how do we bring them together? They found the virtue of compassion is the one thing that will bring people together. It's a bridging virtue. And I do think that's a way of reaching into the heart of the church and saying, how can we look through these issues and increase the virtue of compassion so that we build up that which unites us substantively, and create a culture that's fundamentally based on unity and solidarity. A few years ago in Seattle, or for the Diocese of Washington State, they did this by having a project where they said, how can we bring together the disparate communities in the Catholic Church as they look on politics today? And they said, our commitment as a church for all the dioceses of Washington for the next 5 years is going to be children in the womb and to the age of 5. Thus, bringing together the two agendas that are both Catholic, but which our politics separate, and bring people together. I think that's building compassion and at the virtues, making that at the heart of what we do is the positive task we have to do that's really going to help us get out of it, as well as observing these things we shouldn't be doing.
Can I share a quick story that really piggybacks on what the Cardinal just said? About 10 days ago, I was in Milwaukee speaking to the priests there, and I've been talking to presbyterates for many years, and this is a very common issue. One of the older priests got up and said, we have got the older, more liberal priests, the younger, more conservative, and we're at odds with each other. And, Bishop, what do we do? And, I've talked about these things more theoretically before, but I was just inspired to say, I think you should play golf together. I think you should go to each other's homes. I think you should accept dinner invitations, because you work on your friendship. Likely you're both operating out of caricatures of the other, and I could paint it for you, what the young person's caricature of the older priest and vice versa, but go play golf together and talk to each other and become friends. And probably, I said, you'll figure out that the older guys are holding on to great important values, and so are the younger guys. And the more the two of you talk, the more you'll see a commonality.
That's one of the things the Holy Father mentions in Fratelli Tutti, is the importance of universal fraternity and social friendship. But I would think that in order to do that, we have to be able to listen to one another, listen to the experience and thoughts of the other from a place of genuinely wanting to know and understand. And to me, that sounds like what we are trying to do with the synodal process. And so, Bishop Flores, could you shed some light here on how synodality might come into play to help us develop and have that universal fraternity and develop that social friendship?
Yeah, maybe I can think of a thing or two to say about that. There are probably a number of things on Pope Francis's mind when he asked the church in the world to begin this synodal process we've been in for the last 2.5 years or so. But I think one of them is a kind of a diagnosis of the culture, especially in the West, that is deeply divided and really unable to kind of have a human conversation anymore. It's really very basic. And also a conviction that I think he wants, and I think we have accomplished in some degree, that is that to respond to that, the church has to upgrade the quality of our own communion. That is to say, how it is that we love one another, which is the basic thing the scriptures ask us to show to the world. And that if, to the extent we cannot talk to each other in a charitable, truthful manner, even when we have disagreements, like Bishop Barron said, the Acts of the Apostles is full of those, and so are the letters of St. Paul, but never to breaking the communion of charity. But the remedy is very basic. We have to start speaking to each other with a sense that I didn't really hear what the person is saying, because I can't watch my watch until they finish talking so I can say what my talking points are, which is what we're doing to each other in such a way that we aren't even conscious of it. And so on a very basic level, starting in our local communities, our local parishes, and then our dioceses and so forth, just rebuilding the communal fabric of the church for a very important reason. As the Second Vatican Council taught, that the church is supposed to be a sign and sacrament to the world of a communion that is real and not just a word. And if we aren't radiating some sense of being able to disagree and yet continue to love one another profoundly in Christ, then the world is not receiving the sign that God instituted the church for in the first place in terms of the mission. So that's kind of what I think it's offering to us, first to remedy our own communion in as far as it's frayed, and then to see how we can build up that sense of communion and solidarity outside of ourselves.
As I listen to this, it seems to me that a certain self-mastery of our passions is needed for these conversations, and all of you form men in the seminary to be able to develop self-mastery. What advice do you have to us as lay people as to how we can develop self-mastery?
Well, I think during this first synodal dialogue sessions we had about 2 years ago, to build on what Bishop Flores was saying about communio and listening, one of the universities helped us develop a fairly sophisticated note-taking system for the small group dialogues. And the theme of those questions was, what are your joys in the church? What are your sorrows and what are your hopes? So what was interesting was the pastors and lay leadership told us in the parishes, when they had those small group meetings, they were in the context of a lot of prayer and everything, that people left very exhilarated by it. But when they looked at the notes, people were saying diametrically opposed things in substance. The reason they left pleased with each other was they had encountered each other as disciples from their life of faith first. That was the context, the palpable context for what was going on. And so they could say things that were in substance different and conflicting, sometimes on visceral issues, but they could do so and people accepted it and actually felt good about the exchange because it was in the context of communio and a sense of discipleship. The more we can build that up in our dialogues in the church and then with society, I think the better off we are.
Let's say, yeah, please go ahead, Bishop Barron.
Just to jump in, I'm on a Jesuit broadcast here, to pay tribute to one of my Jesuit heroes, Bernard Lonergan. Lonergan, the great epistemologist, studying the art and science of coming to know. And he always maintained you have to go through a conversion. If you're really to know something, it's not just a matter of the mind, it's a matter of the conversion. You have to be attentive, you have to be intelligent, you have to be reasonable, you've got to be responsible. And I could talk about all four of those, but the point was you can't exercise those moves unless you've converted. In other words, there's all kinds of reasons why we're not attentive. So the Cardinal was pointing out, the importance of listening. Well, that's to overcome our tendency not to be attentive. I know what I'm for, I know what I'm against, and don't confuse me with anything else. And then we've got to be intelligent. It's very hard to be intelligent. It means to think an issue through, entertain different hypotheses, look at different patterns of explanation. It's really hard to do that because we prefer to stay, in the context we're familiar with. Be reasonable means make a judgment. You have to decide finally which of the bright ideas is the right idea. There's all kinds of reasons why we don't want to do that. If I make this judgment, then they're not going to like me. If I make this judgment, I might not get the job I want, etc. And then finally, be responsible means live in accord with your judgments. All kinds of reasons why we don't want to do that. So to your point, it's a very searching question, I think, is how do we train people to enter into this process? It requires a major conversion of the mind, of the heart, of one's life. And that's a spiritual process. That's a spiritual discipline.
Is it possible that you would discern that someone is just not capable at the time for dialoguing with you? So for example, people will engage in ad hominem attacks. People will ask a question where you can tell they already think they know the answer. Are there times when you just have to say, you know what, there's nothing fruitful is going to come from this conversation, and you don't enter into the dialogue? How do you do that without further alienating? How does that work? What would be your suggestions? All of you have engaged in conversations that people would find difficult on topics that sometimes are quite touchy, and yet you have to, I imagine you recognize there's sometimes where dialogue can't be had. Mm-hmm. What would you suggest in those cases? Or what are the hallmarks of, you know what, they're not ready for a conversation with me, or I'm not ready for the conversation with them? What might that look like? How can we tell when best thing to do is to be quiet?
I think there's instances, probably all three of us, Bishop Flores, Bishop Barron, and I have always been in from time to time where the dialogue, so-called dialogue, is not meant to be dialogical, but is meant to be confrontational. And in those instances, it's very difficult. Sometimes you can't enter into a genuine dialogue. And then you have to just speak in very limited ways about things without having that full-bodied conversation that you'd really like to have. So that happens from time to time. And sometimes you have to shut down dialogue if it gets to where I've been in, I held listening sessions from after the Philadelphia grand jury, or about 12 of them, and a certain group took over some of them, and it became very confrontational and attacks upon certain groups of people. And so we had to take steps to limit that. It's very hard, but there are instances, I think, where we have to do that. But that doesn't mean we give up either on the people involved or on the notion of restoring a deeper dialogue, whether it's at that moment or some other moment. But there's some difficult situations, and unfortunately, since confrontation is more and more part and parcel of many public conversations now, it's more frequent, I think.
I would just maybe add, following on that, when you look at the Gospels, the Lord, engaged people very generously, and whoever was approaching him, but he also recognized an insincere question when he got it, and was able to respond quite, like when the young man says, "Oh, good teacher, what must I do?" He says, "Why do you call me good?" I think, and he asked that question, I think, partly because he detects a little flattery there that is not really serving the purpose. Or when Pontius Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He says, "Well, do you say this on your own, or has somebody else been telling you about me?" Because he could, and we can detect sometimes that we're being approached and it's not really a sincere approach. And you can call a person gently on that, and maybe the conversation will continue, and maybe it won't. But the Lord, we have to remember, was quite capable of kind of like saying something that was kind of would kind of open somebody's eyes without being without being, hateful about it, which is what we have trouble with.
How do you
It's a
speak
very,
with some?
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I like your question a lot. It's a very incisive question, because a lot of the postmodern philosophers talk about when a society becomes dysfunctional. So when a society's capacity to talk with itself breaks down. And it happens, I'd use these Lonergan categories again, when we've stopped following these imperatives. And you can tell, I think, in a conversation, whether it's one-on-one or it's online, let's say, when we've passed from we're looking for the truth together to we're defending our egos, we're defending our
Right.
prerogatives. And I can sense it in myself when that's happening. I think I can sense it in a conversation. And then it has become dysfunctional. And I think you're right. It's like a parent calling a timeout for a kid. It was like a penalty flag on the football. It's best if we stop playing for a while. It's best if we step aside and resume only when we can be constructive in the dialogue, because they can break down in very powerful ways, even violent ways. We've seen that happen.
Mhm.
And so I do think stepping away sometime. And one thing I found over the years is, it breaks my heart when someone comes online, let's say, and they're an honest seeker. They're really interested in finding out about Catholicism. And they come on a website, and what do they find? Catholics at each other's throats. Catholics
Yes.
just bickering with each other. Well, how evangelically disedifying, how counterindicated evangelically that is. And so at that point, we, the Catholics involved, should take a time out, So I think you're absolutely right that conversations can become dysfunctional, and then they should be stopped.
A good friend of mine, Father Joshua Johnson, who's director of vocations in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, said to me and to quite a few people, you will be judged for your tweets. Sometimes
Yeah.
we think, oh, we're not saying it with our mouth, that we can just, as my mother would say, act like we have no home training when we get online.
Yeah.
So there's how do we start to, some people say what they do is they put their tweets in the draft and then come back to it and say, do I really want to send that?
Mm-hmm.
How might we be able to recognize in ourselves when, we probably shouldn't say that, even if it's not to somebody's face. We probably shouldn't put that out in the ether for people. How do we recognize that in ourselves? What might be some signs that we need to just take a break?
When truth and love have become disassociated from each other. But you're right, the internet, see, it's really bad, because one-on-one, it's much more difficult. When you're with someone, you're in the same room, you're looking face to face, it's much more difficult. But you're online and they can't see you, they don't know who you are, and you can fire off some, mean-spirited. So I really, that's the test, is truth and love become disassociated. If they have, then the thing has become dysfunctional.
So, sometimes people ask me, how should I vote? And what I say to them is, I just urge you in your conscience, as you walk in the voting booth, think Jesus is there with you, watching what you're doing, and then let that guide you. And I would say maybe the same thing for this. When you're writing the tweet, imagine Jesus is there with you. And when you think through that question, should I do this? Especially if you, many times when you'll come to a point that you mentioned, Gloria, we know we shouldn't do it. And we kind of rationalize why we want to do it. It's what we want to do, but we know we shouldn't. And so I think that's the important moment when we know it's really wrong, to think of what would Jesus say to me if I asked him this question? And if we're bringing it up, we probably know the answer.
Yeah.
I'll ask this last question before we go to the Q&A from our audience that is sending in questions. It seems to me that there's a spirit of fear in our politics. Like the world is going to end if that party that we don't like is in a position of temporal power. How can we as believers, as Catholics, recover from that spirit of fear? How can we recognize it and resist it?
I think friendship again. I'm going to date myself in making this reference, but I was watching a Netflix thing recently, and it was a documentary on William F. Buckley, who was probably the leading conservative pundit in America back in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And in the documentary, they had a section on, I think it was like a birthday party for Buckley or something, and he had several speakers lined up, and a couple were indeed his ideological, allies. But he also had George McGovern, famously liberal Democrat. He had John Kenneth Galbraith, liberal economist. He had Eugene McCarthy, liberal Democrat. And they were all joking about their policy differences. But what was really clear to me, and I thought, boy, it's missing today, was they liked each other. They were friends with each other. And the friendship was more important than the ideological differences. And their very presence there proved it. And I remember thinking as I watched that, boy, that's what's missing today, because we've lost the ground of friendship. And so our ideological differences become so brutal, you know? So a recovery of friendship, go out for dinner, get to know each other better, I think is key.
Well, now I'm going to turn to the questions that we've received in the Q&A. And the first question is, our challenge we face is that Catholics isolate themselves from each other in compatible parishes, places where we all pretty much think alike and have similar politics. Do you, as bishops, see this in your dioceses? And if so, how have you worked to overcome it? So we all do that tribalism at our parish.
Yeah.
And it's no growing of social friendship with others who think differently than we do. Do you see that in your diocese? And if so, how have you been able to overcome it? Or what can you do anything to overcome that?
Well, I would say that it's not just from parish to parish, it's also from mass to mass. I mean, in some ways, in a parish community, you have such diverse communities, which by habit, either because it's a different language or because it's a different music, for whatever reason, or it's the best time to go to mass because that's when, after that is when we do this as a family, that we kind of settle into different sort of strata, I guess. And we become very comfortable with that. I think, you just encourage people, Jesus liked people. Maybe it was good for us to remember that, and that whenever the parish has those like festivals or feast days where we can kind of mix it up more, where people from different, from the neighborhood or have a chance to be together and to eat together and to kind of laugh together and enjoy things together, then it kind of changes the dynamic a bit, and maybe we'll be more able to kind of like be able to maybe just decide that we can look for a wider circle in our lives to kind of open up sort of our own way of thinking and our own way of understanding that the church is a very, very large and diverse reality. It always has been, and it is called to be from every tribe, tongue, and nation. And we need to learn to like that, because that's kind of the way it is in heaven. And if we don't like it here, as Cardinal Newman used to say, chances are we're going to be very miserable in heaven, because that's what people do. Yeah.
Well, this isn't one of the questions from the Q&A, but just from your saying this, both all of you saying the social friendship, the getting together, to me, it seems then that once we have the social friendship, it's when people can share their vulnerabilities, their hurts, the things that disturb them, or their anger, and it's received in a different spirit. Once someone is vulnerable with us, even if we disagree on a particular point, how should we respond when they have that vulnerability to share whatever it is that makes them angry or upset that perhaps we don't agree with? What would be, as believing Catholics, how do we respond in those spaces?
One of the things to touch upon that question, but also the previous question from those listeners. In my diocese, there's a marked difference. We're very diverse culturally. There's a marked difference to how this ideological split occurs within Anglo culture versus Hispanic culture, Filipino culture, Vietnamese culture. The ideological split that's so prominent in our society and political culture, in my experience, is much less prominent in the non-Anglo cultures. And so what is it that now there are different things that divide those cultures internally. It's not that. But why is it that this precise ideological split is less pronounced there? And what can we learn from that in how to approach this question of divide and of listening and a sense of communio, a real family together? It's just an experience I've had, and I think it's fairly common. And I have to ask, why is it different, and how can we learn from those cultures how to bridge this difference, particularly within the Anglo community.
Something I know Bishop Flores and I have very much in common is an affection for Thomas Aquinas. And I've always felt Aquinas is such a model in this regard. And one way is he steel-manned his opponent's argument, the opposite of straw man. So straw man, we put up a simplistic version of the opponent's argument, we knock it down. When you steel man an argument of your opponent, you present it in the most persuasive way you can. You enter into their perspective. Aquinas did that consistently. Now, he didn't just cave into that argument. He then responded, But when you do that, you accomplish a number of things. And one is you show a deep respect for the person talking to you. You say, I've really heard you. And I've heard you so well, in fact, that I'm going to present your argument maybe even better than you did, And then when you're coming to greater perception of things, it'll be much more effectively accomplished if you've really given full weight and respect to your opponent's point of view. I've said this for years, learning again how to argue, because to me, argument is a good thing. It's a nonviolent means of adjudicating disputes, right? It's not fighting, it's not hurling invective, it's marshaling evidence, listening to your opponent's point of view, taking it very seriously, drawing conclusions from premises, answering objections, etc. It's a way of non-violently engaging someone that you disagree with. But it's a lost art. Go online if you doubt me. No one knows how to construct an argument. It's all invective and name calling and smear tactics. So, we have a great tradition within Catholicism of a disciplined intellectual conversation. Thomas Aquinas being the prime example of how to do it. I think teaching people, young people especially, how to have a real argument, it would be a good thing.
One of the things I was thinking about is in my pre-Cana with my husband and I, they were teaching us how to argue. And right.
Yeah.
So you love this person.
Yeah.
And before you speak, you mirror back what it is that they expressed that was on their mind, and you mirror it back until they felt satisfied that you understood and were sharing with them exactly what you say.
Right.
So of course, that's my spouse. So I have a deep love for him, and seems like infinite patience as he does with me. Seems like that is something that we could perhaps bring to the table. Now, I may not love you like I love my spouse, but what I love is this common life we plan to share together, planning for the future of our country and our families. That these would be the things that would bond us together, regardless of our belief. That should hopefully be that motivation for trying to understand one another. Another question someone asked is, how can we best engage clergy in healthy political discussion? I mean, how do you work your own priests to make parishes a place of welcome that model dialogue? So how can we do that with our clergy at the parish level?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I think that's unfair because the priests have so many responsibilities that something gets wrong, they're kind of level holding the hook. So how would we do this at the parish level?
Well, I think one practical thing to say, whenever we have like a suggestion that could really help the quality of the parish life, especially as a local expression of the communion of the church, say, Father, I think this could be really helpful. How can I help you make this happen? Because one of the things Synodality teaches us is that we can't keep saying to it, well, those people over there really need to do something about this, when it's us. And I have found, priests are generally quite open to kind of, well, how can you help me? Do you know some people who could really put this together? Maybe start a particular, maybe start small. Anyway, at least just start talking about the how and how can I help you? And I think it works both ways, because that's part of the participation thing, and saying, well, it's really too bad nobody in the church does that. And then we sit silent, and well, you're part of the church. And so if there are ways that you can kind of bring people to kind of work together on something that maybe you feel very passionate about. And I think we'd be surprised at how effective that can be.
So
I do think the synodal methodology of discernment is a way we can bring into parishes, in decision-making in parishes, but also in areas of conflict within parishes, precisely because it's rooted in prayer, in unity, and in believing that God is in charge of the whole discussion, that God is driving the dialogue. But it's a different way for us to learn how to do that. The other difficulty is priests do not like conflict
Mm.
and do not like to address issues of conflict, whether it's, conflict in the life of the parish or in the wider society, because it divides their people. And so that's something too. So we have to, I do think the synodal pathway is a way we can begin to do that, although we had to develop analogous ways for our own culture. And it's consonant with parish life as it exists, where we make that discernment more prominent and the debate less prominent.
Speaking of,
I brought up, oh, sorry, Gloria.
well, I
Something
was just gonna say, go ahead, Mr.
Something
Barron.
I brought up, but I think it was our Presbyteral Council meeting recently. I said the recent document from the Vatican, Dignitas Infinita, I said, that's a great way, I think, to express the variety and the sort of inclusive quality of Catholic social teaching. And I said, maybe use that as a source, as a teaching document for, your people. I encourage the priests themselves to read it carefully. And I thought it was a great way to overcome some of these political splits, because you see that unique character of the church's social teaching. So that document, I think, could be very useful.
One of the things that I loved about that document is to remind us of the infinite dignity that each person has. And I think that has to come into play with these conversations, that you have a deep respect for the person with whom you're dialoguing, even if you disagree deeply with them, because we are family. We're both made in the image and likeness of God. And from that, we have this infinite dignity. That's, I think, a really grounding sort of perspective to have. Another question that has come up, speaking of conflict, is can you give an example of how you modeled encounter by crossing over into an uncomfortable space to build friendship with those who disagree with you? I'll start to give you just a moment to think about it. I was invited to be a part of a discussion around post-Roe America. And boy, when I got there, it was like, oh, you believers are this and that and the other, and you don't like women, and just that whole kind of bag that because I'm a Catholic, and so they had this certain idea about who I was and what I would stand for, and all the language was really, to me, designed to provoke. But I was listening to the other gentleman who believed in women's rights in a different way than I do. And so I said to him, I think we both agree about the dignity and equality of women, but we disagree on how to get there. And so I think acknowledging that we share the same goal, we want women to flourish in society, but how we get there, we disagree about. And so to recognize that good thing in him sort of diffused the whole situation. And it was quite ugly, but to maybe recognize the good in that other person, to recognize the one thing, the ends that you both agree to, but the means, you wouldn't agree on. So that was an example of a way I crossed over. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of time to think of an example that you might want to share.
Well, recently, in the context of the events in the Middle East, after the Hamas attack on Israel and then the beginning of the war in Gaza, the bombing, the other two Christian bishops and I here in San Diego, the Lutheran bishop and the Episcopal bishop, decided we come out with a statement on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because we were afraid even at that very early moment that was going to be on the rise. So we met with the Jewish groups and the Muslim groups and others, and issued what we thought was a pretty good statement on those questions. Well, no one liked it because we were not siding with either side. Each side said to us, basically, we need you to be with us on this. So the Muslim leadership is saying, we need you to be with us and calling for a ceasefire. This is very early on. And the Jewish side would say, we need you to be with us in our suffering, because that was first, and because of who we are as a people historically. So what we've experienced here is a rather collapse in interfaith relationships in the light of what's going on in the Middle East. And so we had to really rethink. We thought what we were doing was really quite good, And it was on a certain level, as it was saying good things, but it didn't enter into the reality that those two communities, the Muslim community and the Jewish community, were feeling, and the rawness that they felt. And so we had to come to a whole different way of approaching it. It's very hard in that because those are wrenching issues for those two communities. And what we thought was the right pathway, we learned we really just weren't tuned in to what was going on, to what the realities were.
One of the experiences I have every once in a while, perhaps not too infrequently, is being asked to come and take questions. It's happened in different parts of the country where I've been about the immigration situation happening on the border. And I know I'm going to get some very tough questions about, well, what's happening? This is what I'm hearing. And what I found is, first of all, to listen to where the question coming from and listen to the concerns. And when I can say, I don't disagree with you in what you're saying here, or in that part, I mean, just to affirm when I can affirm, and then maybe, once you kind of said that, then to kind of maybe clear up some what I would consider misinformation about what's actually happening. I mean, I live here. And so and just to kind of be able to say, well, this is what I see. And this is why, we need to kind of work to find a solution, because a great many people are suffering, and it's in nobody's interest to kind of just let it fester. So anyway, affirm when you can affirm, and clarify when you can clarify, and give a certain testimony that what the church, in whatever her teaching is on social justice, is trying to do is to defend the dignity of a human being or of a family that is in dire circumstances. That's one of the principal aspects of Catholic social teaching in many, many different churches. And that's kind of like the ratio, the reason the church is present in a lot of places where polite society wouldn't necessarily want to be.
I'll give you a quick example. I have this program online where I interview, people in kind of a long form interview. And this fellow came on my radar screen just about a year ago, Ro Khanna, he's a representative out in Silicon Valley in California. And he's emerged as I think a very interesting political figure on the scene, a Democrat, but kind of willing to cross the line in some ways, and, interesting guy. Well, we had an hour-long talk, and I brought to bear Catholic social teaching in different areas. And we found that we had a lot in common in economic matters and other matters, and we're getting along famously. At the very end, I brought up the question of abortion, and I've been a very strong, advocate of the pro-life position. I've challenged Democratic politicians on that. And what I love about the conversation is I was able to say all of that very clearly, but we had by that time, I would say become friends, but we'd become at least friendly in the course of the conversation. And it enabled him, I think, to hear what I was saying. And we had a frank, and we disagreed certainly, but it was a constructive conversation, I thought, So I love that. I took it as it was kind of a grace when you have that opportunity to enter into it, because he's a Hindu. He's a Democrat, so he would not share my religious background. He would not share entirely my Catholic political view, but I think we were able to have a real conversation. And then I saw him recently when I was in Washington, and we had dinner together. And so I like that, the opportunity to establish again those friendships.
We have a question. Are there programs you would recommend, as such as Brave or Angels or others, that can help Catholics learn and practice dialogue? Because it does seem like we all agree that this is a skill that needs developing. Can you think of any programs?
Well, I'm not a great one to recommend programs. I'm just going to say, because I don't know them so well. But, I think before the program, I really think we all need to be kind of like reading the gospel more and letting a little dialogue with Jesus happen inside ourselves on a daily basis. And I think that improves the quality of my dialogue with one another immensely. And it's a spirit, because we talked a little bit more about earlier about a spiritual discipline of temperance and so forth. There's a spiritual discipline of kind of knowing the way of the Lord. And it's only by dialoguing with him first. And as Cardinal mentioned about the prayerful atmosphere in synodality, that then kind of it has an effect even before we realize it in how we talk to each other.
One of the things that I was thinking about
I go back to or not. Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about that I know you all said this morning when you got up was the invitatory. Lord, open my lips and my mouth will proclaim your praise. I sometimes wish people would pray the divine office, pray to the liturgy of the hours to remember what speech is for, right? Is to reveal the truth so that people using right reason can make better decisions. So how do we, when we open our mouth, are we praising God? Are we praising Christ? Or are we just making ourselves feel better? So there does have to be, I think, some sense of humility when we engage in these conversations. And it just, if I could make a suggestion, something that has been helpful for me is definitely saying morning and evening prayer, the divine office, the liturgy of the hours. That's also something that's unifying, that if you can't play golf, maybe you can pray the hours together.
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That would just be something I was thinking about.
I would say it's not a program, but one of the reservoirs that can help us in this, I think, are the women religious in the country. In that they have a tradition now of dialogue that they've deepened in these decades. And in our diocese, they're helping in some of the communities to learn, how do you do discernment? How do you do in terms of a parish setting? They are, because they have this experience, they can share that with us and with parishes and with leadership and priests and so forth. And I think that's a good source of how to understand on this level how we should be moving toward greater dialogue in the spirit.
Maybe there has to be like a detox, first. I know my brothers would know about this in the seminary system now. We have the propedeutic year. And a big part of that is to detox the young people from social media. Because, maybe we have to get over some of those really bad habits. I've encouraged people, look, even though I use social media, I want people to watch my things, but I've said, stay off it, or at least reduce your time. Maybe stay off of com boxes, watch it, but don't say anything. So there might have to be a detoxing move before we can then learn more positively how to argue in friendship and how to engage. But there is a real dysfunction that's come into our minds and hearts, unfortunately.
Do you think we can all agree that com boxes are an occasion of sin?
Yeah. Yeah. What I
Yes.
always hear though, when I've raised it, I've said, like, why do we have to have these things? And the answer is always they increase, views and all that, which I get. But I do think they're largely dysfunctional, in my humble opinion.
Well, maybe they can be places where we're like, oh, we're increasing our prayer list, that we see who we
Yeah.
need to pray and fast for, as well as ourselves, of course, because we all have our own weakness and brokenness. But maybe that's the other way we can use it, is when we see things that are just so odious, if you will, that we could take that person to prayer, take that maybe fast for the conversations that are happening in the com boxes. Not an easy thing, believe me, not an easy thing. But I also think about how the Lord's like, well, Gloria, you're no peach when you were sinning. So to remember that. So maybe maybe a question or two, and then we're gonna wrap because it's getting close to our time. Someone asked, as a church, how can we speak with a more united voice that resists partisanship and puts faith before party affiliation?
Well, I think the short answer for me is, as a church, it needs to start with me as an individual. I have to examine my conscience exactly on where that line is, because it's a very important line that's kind of indicated in that question, and that is, how faith, can be affected by party loyalty and by partisanship. And I think, it's something that we're liable to say that happens to those people over there, but it doesn't affect me. But I think we really do have to. I mean, if we're going to take the gospel seriously, look at the beam in your own eye, and just be honest in an examination, and then kind of learn to make some of those distinctions, that the faith sometimes calls us to an obedience that is beyond what politics envisions. And I think we need to kind of admit that to the Lord and in the communion of the church, and kind of help one another to kind of lift that cross today, because the world pressures us very much to kind of take a side and be with the winning team or the losing, whatever. But the side is God is, we want to be where he is, and that's where the Christ Jesus asks us, and most often that's with the poor and the vulnerable, because that's where he spent most of his time. And that's why the church's social teaching is such an important part of who we are and where we want to be in the political dialogue.
I'd say that I think it's important for all of us to understand Catholic social teaching bisects our current party structure.
Right.
And so for every believing Catholic, voting is an act of conscience and an act of citizenship and an act of faith. But it's one that we should not be going to with a sense of victory, but a sense of always understanding that in our voting, we are conflicted and deep, like Kierkegaard, with fear and trembling and sickness unto death. We vote because we know that no one encapsulates even the bulk of what the church calls us to be and do and work for in our society.
How should we, let me ask this, because I see so much of, oh my gosh, if that other party wins, it's going to be awful for us, and a lot of fear. How are we to accept, how should we as Catholics behave if indeed the party that we didn't want to, win wins? What should be our response afterwards, after an election's over, after everyone's voted, and whomever receives whatever that position is, let's say we disagree with whoever's elected, how should we respond? How are we to behave ourselves after that?
Well, I think our first responsibility is to kind of always be engaged in the political process and not just between just an election time. And that is to say, because sometimes it even happens that the party we wanted to win wins, and then we kind of let it go because, well, they're in charge now, so we won. When we don't admit the fact that no party, as Cardinal said, is going to completely hold to the convictions that we hold as Catholics, and that we need to even resist the party we are in favor of when they are promoting something that we know in conscience we cannot support. And sometimes we don't do that because we kind of want to give them a free pass, and then only be against the people that are kind of on the other side. But even if the other party wins, you have to be engaged. And politics is local; it's also state. And there's a lot of and just be involved and do the best you can to kind of promote the good and avoid the evil and resist it. But promoting the good, it's always possible.
No, I agree with that. I mean, Jesus Christ is Lord, and we shouldn't allow the politicians to position us or him as though they're all important. I like Bill Maher the other night. I saw him and he was saying to his followers, like, okay, if Trump wins, I hate Trump, but if he wins, the sun will come up and the country will go on. And I thought it was a good move on his part. And it was patriotic in the best sense to say, okay, the country will go on. But we, especially as Christians, as Catholics, Jesus Christ is Lord. And so that we're not beholden to either a political party. We don't think they determine, what's most important in the country. We declare the Lord Jesus Christ risen from the dead, and that's where our hope comes from. And so I think we have to have a detachment from this hyper stress on the political.
I think our politics now betrays a sense that each side doesn't want the other to get any victories or to make progress. And I think really one of the things we'd be called upon after the election, whoever wins, is to genuinely pray for not only the good of the country, but that whoever is in those positions will accomplish good things for the country. We don't want to pray that they will fail. We want to really pray and believe and hope that they will succeed.
Amen. And I love what you said, Bishop Barron. We have to remember, no matter who's in the White House, the mayor's house, the city council, Jesus Christ is on the throne.
Amen.
That's what we need to remember. So thank you so much, Cardinal McElroy, Bishop Flores, and Bishop Barron for joining us today. And thank you to our audience members for coming together for this important discussion. If you want to learn more about Civilize It and perhaps even take the pledge, visit civilizeit.org for prayers, reflections, and learning resources. We hope that you continue this discussion in your dioceses, parishes, and organizations, and stay tuned for more Civilize It content from the USCCB as we journey through this year together. And we are open to your feedback. You can offer feedback on this event via a survey that will be sent to your email shortly. Thank you so much, and go out there and have civil conversations.
Very good.